Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 36th episode of A QISSAA with Ishika, quintessential and inspiring stories of South Asian artists, presented to you and funded partially by the California Arts Council Individual Artist Fellow Grant. My name is Ishika Muchal, and I'm coming to you from the unceded ancestral lands of the Gabrielino Tongva people, also known as Los Angeles, California. I am beyond thrilled to welcome my guest today, playwright Rehana Lew Mirza. With a BFA from NYU TISCH and an MFA from Columbia University, Rehana's prolific career has seen her plays produced at venues across the United States. Some play highlights include Hatefuck, A People's Guide to History in the Time of Here and Now, Soldier X, Tomorrow Inshallah, Neighborhood Watch, and Barriers. She founded the award-winning South Asian theater and film company Desipina Co. alongside her sister Rohi Mirza Pandya in 2001, where together they produced the popular 7-Eleven series. She shares a Kleban Award and a 2016 to 2022 Mellon Foundation National Playwright Residency, administered in partnership with Howlround at NYU with Mike Lew. Together, they've co-written the Colonialism Project, through an LJP commission, and the musical Bhangra Nation, originally Bhangin It, with composer and lyricist Sam Willmott, which I was lucky enough to see at La Jolla Playhouse, also co-starring two of my previous QISSAA guests, Ari Afsar and Ramita Ravi. Rehana's short film Modern Day Arranged Marriage won the NBC ShortCuts Audience Award and screened at Just for Laughs in Montreal before being acquired by Logo MTV. Her feature film, Hiding Divya, had a limited North American release and toured to colleges through a grant from the Asian Women's Giving Circle. Her additional accolades include being a WP Resident Playwright, NYFA Fellow, HBO Access Fellow, Lilly Award recipient, CCTP Resident, Colt Coeur, I hope I'm saying that right, member, and a TCG Fellow. I am so beyond thrilled to welcome Rehana Lew Mirza. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
It's so cool to have a conversation with someone who I've seen the work of live.
Yeah, I'm really touched that you made it out to La Jolla to see the musical.
Yeah,
when folks see my work and my writing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's so rare to see theater where you feel yourself represented. So I heard about that and I was like, oh my God, a Bhangra team in theater? I'm going. Absolutely.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Me and my parents loved it. We really loved it.
We rewrote it quite a bit and just finished up a run last year at Birmingham Rep in the UK, which is so different from La Jolla.
Very different. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here and share your journey. And so I just want to dive right in. How did you get introduced to the arts and what made you decide that you want to do this as a career?
Yeah, I mean, I started early on, which I think is probably rare for a lot of folks. So I was always writing as a little kid before I even knew how to write words. I was pretending I was writing and on a typewriter and plunking away. It was an archaic thing that was supposed to be thrown out, but I insisted that I wanted it as my toy. And so I think it was always in me to want to do some sort of artistic pursuit. And then I'd gotten into short stories and poetry as one does as a teenager. And my sister was encouraged me to expand my horizons and try something new. I'm young. And so she told me to try out playwriting at a local university at Montclair State. And I had my brother drive me at like 9 a.m. to playwriting classes, and then I never quit.
Wow.
Kept going.
Shout out to your siblings then in that case. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
amazing. So what drew you to like playwriting, and how did that translate into the stories that you like to tell?
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up in New Jersey, and at the time, there wasn't a lot of stories that reflected my family or even reflected my life experience. My dad, growing up, he would bring ghazal singers in from Pakistan
Mhm.
and India and tour them around the U.S.
Oh, wow.
Um, and and part of that as producing that because he just loved the arts and
Right.
part of that he would have me looking through a phone book and
Mhm.
highlighting any South Asian names and inviting them to the show. And I think for me, it like really instilled with me the sense of community and
Mhm.
like and wanting to form that through artistic endeavors. And with
Yeah.
playwriting, it was kind of two for one. I could get to work with other people and like and have that community and bring in a community through the audience, but also have myself and my family and my experiences reflected in a way.
Yeah, definitely. It's so interesting the trajectory of I feel so many artists that I've spoken to is I didn't see myself represented,
Yeah,
so I'm
yeah.
gonna do something about that. And I think
Mm.
that's so powerful about, like, speaking to the agency that we have as artists and creators to make ourselves and other around us feel seen.
Yeah, I think it's the most important thing one can do is sort of
Mhm.
and, as I continue with the writing and obviously, like, the joke is your first play is always going to be, like, you put everything in it,
Yeah.
like, 'cause you feel like everything that's ever happened to you has to go in that one play,
Right,
and then
right.
I realize that you can tell a breadth of stories and
Mhm.
different angles, and it becomes about sort of the questions that you're interrogating as a human
Mhm.
being, like, what's important to you and why, and how does it
Yeah.
fit within society, and it's still all reflective of yourself, but just in a very different way.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, it's like, "Oh, do I have to tell my entire story?" Absolutely. Yeah, my first play, I definitely put everything I got in there, so
Yeah.
that's a good note for me as well. What were some of the early struggles in your journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was tough. The community did not get formed right away.
Right.
Like, just when I started writing, I went to NYU TISCH, and at the time, I was probably I believe I was the only South Asian in the
Mhm,
dramatic writing program to
mhm.
the extent that my thesis advisor I remember chased after me on graduation, was like, "I found another person who you might wanna talk to. They're at
Yeah.
Columbia, and their name is Sabrina Devan." And it was hilarious, but that was sort of like, that was the limitations of
Mhm.
sort of when you go institutional with the art and, like,
Right.
the limitations of going through an institution is that it's very segregated in a lot of ways. It's very
Sure.
insulated. And so, even when I was writing my thesis project at the time, it was based off of me and my sister in a lot of ways, who's a
Mhm,
big inspiration for me.
mhm,
Is a sisterhood relationship in a Pakistani family. And my thesis advisor got in an argument with the industry professional there to
mhm.
talk about the script because the industry professionals said realistically something like this is not going to get produced.
Hmm.
And that was just a time at which I was going to school for writing. Like,
Right.
there was a lot of stories out there, and there wasn't a lot of diversity around storytelling that
Mhm.
I guess they didn't figure out that they can make billions of dollars off of stories that were reflective of the global majority, so they were
Right,
like,
right. Almost like
"Forget that."
people want that.
So, and I just sat back and I watched the 2, like, professionals duke it out, but it
Right.
never really, um it actually encouraged me to pursue even further the things I wanted to say,
Mhm.
rather than discourage me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great because I was gonna ask you, did you ever feel like a pressure to fit in? But I'm happy to hear that, like, it kind of emboldened your artistic voice and vision for the stories that you were wanting to tell?
I might be a lot richer if I had the pressure to fit in.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
Money rich versus like stories rich. So
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
What material are you drawn towards talking about? Like we touched on like generally stories that you feel seen in, but like what type of stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'm always really activated by stories that I feel would otherwise go unheard. And
Mhm.
that's like a big range, but like it's sort of things when I see history getting forgotten or erased, like I have an urge to like reconstruct it and be like, no, like we cannot like sit
Right.
there and let history get whitewashed or history get erased or
Mhm.
whatever thing that is driving me. I get drawn to stories um, that are really defiant in a lot of ways, and I
Mhm.
think that like that just I used to early on say, like, I write stories in a scream because I was always
Mm,
taught that good girls should be quiet.
period.
Um,
Yeah.
so I still I still really feel that inside, like, that the stories I wanna tell are very much, like,
Right.
must be told in a certain
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny, I'm working on another podcast right now that's talking a lot about, like, the silencing of female voices in terms of, like, body autonomy agency, and, it's the same with our stories, like, the more that those stories get repressed, it's like the more important they are to say and, like, put out
way.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, and you were talking about earlier your collaboration and, like, your kind of inspiration with your sister, and I wanna ask you about your 7-Eleven series, and because that's, like, all set in a convenience store, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so how does location play a part in the stories that you tell specifically with that one and in general as, like, a character in itself?
Well, that series, I mean, it was sort of like lightning in a bottle kind of thing
Mhm.
where I was looking for community and I was like, well, I could write my plays and we produce my plays, but that does create community, but like I want to meet other writers. I want to meet
Right.
other like a lot of folks. So I tried to figure out a way to do that. And then I had heard this quote. It was a senator's wife, and they said they're everywhere in every 7-Eleven and gas station or convenience store, something that was
Mhm.
along those lines. And that was like, that started getting me really thinking. And then when my sister and I were looking for a space to do work, the
Mhm.
Tenement Museum had
Mhm.
actually offered up some sort of residency. And my sister was like, what do you think? What can we do here? And so all of those things kind of started to come together in my mind. Like I was
Right.
like, oh, we do 7-Eleven, like the Tenement Museum. It's like we always joked around. It was like it was like literally like we were in a tenement doing
Right.
the work. It was so great. The low ceilings and the people walking by would like look through the storefront and watch the shows.
Mhm.
Um, so we wanted like it really felt like a convenience store where you could come in and go out and like
Right.
catch theater and an underground New York thing. So definitely location really plays a lot in terms of how I'm imagining space, like theatrical
Yeah.
space.
Yeah, and that feels very much like a site-specific performance, and I think those are always so powerful to watch.
Yeah, I think for you have I feel like you have to know the limitations of your space in a lot of
Mhm.
ways, and and um, like I don't think I could do anything else in that tenement museum theater space other than
Sure.
that.
Yeah. Um, well, this story that you're talking about was, of course, inspired by something you heard, on you said the news, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but, with other stories that you maybe don't have a direct experience in, uh, how do you bring the nuances of an external experience into creating an authentic world in your plays?
Yeah, I mean, I think, um, all the things come up, which is like writing is rewriting. And so like my first take on it is not going to have the level of nuance that I personally want, but also when I start, I do start from a place of like, what is interesting about the scenario? So like looking at a place of character and circumstance, and like how character comes out of circumstance and how they react in these pressure situations, and then kind of like building from there.
Right.
And that's kind of how I start creating the layering that I want in plays. Like, so if it's not my story, or if it's something that's brought to me, I still try to look at it being like, okay, who is this character and what parts of myself are in this character, and
Absolutely.
how do I create scenario, and what parts are different, because I think that's really important to look at too. It's like, how would this person respond versus how I would respond, and how do I leave room for the full breadth of that?
Yeah, because I think it's such like a thing that I respect about writers in general is like how do you create such different voices for each character and not like let them sound like yourself saying different lines, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Actually.
Yeah. And do you do your own dramaturgical work or do you work with a dramaturg?
I don't tend to work with a dramaturg that much, although I respect the work that a dramaturg
Mhm.
does. Although for Bangin' It, Bhangra Nation, there was a great dramaturg, Natasha Sinha, who came on board, and
Oh,
she had just really asked good questions. And I think that's
mhm.
like really, for me, like whether they're the official dramaturg or whether it's another writer or an actor who's working on the piece, I think
Sure.
everyone can have really great questions and start a
Mhm.
dialogue that's like very helpful in terms of developing a piece.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as a performer, dramaturgy and like that kind of table work aspect when you're digging into the world is my favorite part of any play process.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's yeah, you don't really know what you have until you're in a room with other people.
Definitely. Yeah. So, how would you say your process is different when you're writing something independently versus working with collaborators, whether that be like a fellow playwright or just like devising work with a creative team?
Yeah, like I think for me, independently, it's I get to try things out, um and with a collaborator, I think we get to talk things out.
Mhm.
You know?
Right.
So, like, alone, I have to just kind of try it out and, like, and, uh, potentially fail and learn from that.
Mhm.
But with a collaborator, I can be like, "What do you think of this?" And then we talk it out, and they're like, "I don't know, it's just not, like, not hitting me the right way." And I'm like, "I wonder why." And then, like, that process always gets us to, like, the second idea, the third idea, the fourth idea.
Mm.
That tends to be the best idea, is the one that's, like,
Yeah.
neither person has, and it's just something that is created in the room. Whereas on my own, like, I think I can have more eureka moments. I can be sitting there, I can be wrestling with a text alone, and it's, both less embarrassing and more embarrassing at times.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to gain from like a cross-pollinatory experience.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for
I do
sure.
sort of like
I love working with other people on work. It just it
that. Mhm.
I don't know. We share a brain. It makes it easier sometimes.
Definitely. And, so you write with Rohi and with Mike, correct? I'm sorry?
I write, no, Rui tends to just produce,
Okay.
all the things, and then I write with Mike, and then I write with composers,
Okay.
lyricists, like, so with Ari, actually,
Right.
we
Mhm.
started working on something, and then
Mhm.
Sam, who composed and wrote the lyrics for Bangin' It, Bhangra
Right.
Nation, um, we wrote with him. Yeah,
Mhm.
so, and then hopefully I'll keep finding new collaborators to write with.
Yeah, definitely. And how is your process different from, like, stage versus screenwriting?
Yeah, it's definitely a different part of your brain,
Mhm.
going back and forth between the two. I think for me, theater is so much about theatricality and like that space, and like everyone is viscerally in a room together, and how do you capitalize off of that momentum and that movement, and how the dialogue pushes action forward. And then with film, it's just like a different cap I put on, in terms of like the scenes are shorter. You start in the middle of a scene, you end with like a dramatic question each time, kind of thing. And it's like, it's a structural thing as well, a little bit. So it gets a little technical, but like, you know, the shortcut is like visual format versus dialogue format, but I find that to be like a little too easy. But yeah, that's the easy one.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And I guess kind of going back to what we were talking about in terms of representation, I feel like so often we're kind of pigeonholed into this idea of like, you have to write a South Asian story because you're a person of color, you know? So I guess, how would you define what constitutes a South Asian story, and how do you think we can both expand and honor that label to like most authentically represent the broad variety of stories within the diaspora?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard because I think around identity, I'm not sure. Going back to like the simplest answer, I think folks sometimes want the simplest answer.
Right.
Like when they're looking, they're like, "Hey, you're a woman, write a woman thing," or like, "Hey, you're, South Asian, write a South Asian thing." And then their definition of South Asian, though, is like limited by what they consider South
Yeah.
Asian. So it's not even allowing you to write what your own personal experience is within the South Asian community.
Yeah.
So I think first and foremost, to expand the sort of buckets that we're all put in, I think we need to start embracing multiracial, like third gen kid identity more, and understand that all of us hold a multiplicity of identity within us. And then in terms of like showing how South Asian stories aren't a monolith, and if there's like billions and billions of stories.
Right.
I mean, I think it's kind of a losing battle, right? Because it's making that case, because nobody's sitting around making a case for like not like the mainstream, I guess, stories, like, or white stories are not like sitting there being like, plenty of white stories can be told. Like, allow us to do that. Or like, plenty of mainstream, like, blockbuster films can be told. Like, let me expound upon how many different, they're just out there doing it and getting funded to do it. So I think even like the terminology that I'm using around it is probably problematic, even in terms of considering like what is considered mainstream versus like what is considered South Asian, quote unquote. And like when there is a crossover, it becomes like the latest thing, but there's never like a full threshold of like just having it all be in existence with one another.
Right.
And I'm not sure why that is. I mean, I will never forget this. I was on a panel once, and I was trying to award theater companies, and there was like maybe 3 Asian American theater companies, and they were so different in terms of like work aesthetic. Like one did classics and one did like, sci-fi. And someone was like, "Is this too many Asian Americans?" And I was sort of like, what is too many? And I think that's like kind of the problem. I think like, limiting. It's sort of like this idea that can only be one. That like, and it's purposeful in order to maintain power. But I think as people start investing more, like I think putting money in as like money as a community, as like buying power and money and investment within the arts becomes more and more prolific, I guess, then the tides will shift.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you're saying about like this idea of like a scarcity mindset is such a tool of oppression, honestly.
Yeah.
And the idea that like, you only a certain few people can get like the opportunity because it's so limited. And then I think of like, I saw shows like Never Have I Ever, right? And people were like, "Oh, I don't like feel seen in this." And I'm like, "It's one story. We
I
got
know.
one story and you're
know.
expecting to be
Yeah.
seen and represented. You're like with your broad, likely different experience with that one thing. Whereas like you're saying, quote unquote, mainstream media has so many different options for us for like other people to pick from to feel seen. I'm like, you
Yeah,
can't try to feel seen in one thing. Make more stuff.
I
Yeah.
know. And I think like thanks for distilling my rambling into that such a succinct comment. It's very true. Like, yeah, scarcity mentality. It's all it boils down to.
Yeah.
Excuse me 1 second.
Yeah. Tis the season for for illness.
I'm sorry.
No worries
I
at
don't know
all.
what happened. Scarcity mentality makes me choke.
It doesn't. Yeah, it does. So we kind of met at working at the intersection of like arts and activism, and
Yeah.
so a lot of your work feels like it's adjacent or kind of motivated by that. So can you talk about how you feel like art can be that vessel for activism and advocacy in a broader sense?
Yeah, I mean, I always think that, like what you were saying, this people look at stories and they try to see themselves in it.
Right.
So I feel like the more stories that exist, that is creating culture change.
Right.
That is showing, that is moving from like, this is mainstream, this is niche, to like, this is not niche. This can exist within the mainstream as well. And so
Yeah.
I think for me, that's where sort of the storytelling as activism aspect comes in, but also
Right.
in terms of the stories that I choose to tell. I really want to provoke people and show and have them leave questioning. Like I never want someone to like leave and just be like, "Oh, that was a good story. That
Right.
was nice." I
Right.
want them to really be thinking about like, "Oh, what is my role as a human in society?" And like,
Yeah.
how do I fit into the equation? How do I make the world better?
Mhm. Yeah. Can you talk about some of like the stories that you've told and like what made you tell some of like your favorite ones?
Yeah. I mean, I'm about to have a production of a play that I've always loved, but is a little bit older, called Neighborhood Watch.
Okay.
It's a little storefront theater called Jackalope in Chicago, and it's basically about a man, Paul, who starts to slowly like descend into the belief that his next door neighbor is a terrorist. So he starts to terrorize his daughter and his whole neighborhood.
Mm.
And sort of the idea of like, and it just plays around with sort of like the idea that we're all post-racial in some ways and like liberal, but then like we can all fall into sort of traps and fears, and it's
Right.
really um, sort of stoked by news and media we consume. And despite like trying and despite knowing better, like I think
Mhm.
like when confronted with like the same media over and over again, you can't help but sometimes fall into these stereotypes. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to explore. And
Right.
then with Hatefuck, it's about two novelists duke it out, and they one kind of trades in sort of South Asian stereotypes and anti-Muslim
Mhm.
rhetoric in his novels, and there's a professor who finds it repulsive and wants to kind of confront him, and they end up
Mhm.
sleeping with one another and embarking on a relationship based off of that.
Okay.
And that kind of asks the question of like, can you change somebody
Mm.
through love or
Yeah.
hate?
Through an enemy to lovers trope we love.
And so yeah, those are a couple of the things that I'm trying to explore. And then with like the musical that you saw, that
Mhm.
one's like a beast and complicated. And it had started off as a screenplay that I had written.
Mhm.
It was just more fun, Bring It On Bears, kind of a Pitch Perfect kind of thing. But
Right.
then
Right.
as it became musicalized, we started to see how complicated some of the community questions of like being South Asian American, how that just like what some of the questions are that we're asking with it. And so we're basically following Mary, a mixed race college student who's on a Bhangra team and doesn't feel like she fits in. So she forms her own ragtag Bhangra team of her own. And then Preeti feels like her Bhangra team is not reflective of her family and her community and culture as a Punjabi American college student, and tries to remake her team in her own image. And it's really just about sort of what we were talking about how in a scarcity mentality, when you're like, oh, there can only be one, you can like my version of culture has to win, my life experience has to win. Like, never have I ever doesn't represent me, therefore it's bad and wrong. It's like, no, like I think because of, you know, unfortunately how we've all been sort of starved out from any sort of representation, we kind of react in this way. But in reality, we have to kind of look at and acknowledge that everyone's lived experience will be different and will be coming from different places. And as a community, how do we best come together on that?
Right. Yeah. I found watching Bhangin It, Bhangra Nation so powerful, because I was like, there's so many elements of, even though I don't have like the mixed experience, I was like, I understand this idea of not feeling good enough or not feeling enough. And I think that's such like a universal like immigrant experience, regardless of being South Asian, of, oh, I'm like not enough for this community, but I'm also not enough for this community. So where do I really belong, you know?
Yeah,
and
completely.
Yeah, being compared to like the whole Preeti dynamic of, you know, there's people from India who like celebrate holidays in a certain way, for example, and then like we're doing what we can here, and then that level of comparison of like, oh, it's not good enough, and I'm like, oh, but I'm not there, I'm here, so this is what we're doing, you know? Yeah. So it's a really powerful show, really, really good.
Aw, thanks. Yeah, and I mean, it's a question I'm constantly asking, so it might show up in, you know, other pieces of my work too, in terms of like, how do you create culture? Like, what is the culture that we're working to create here in the U.S. That's different from anywhere else? And it's something that I'm really fascinated about.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you feel like your art has shaped your identity? I know like your identity has obviously shaped your art like you've described, but do you feel like the opposite is also true?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, like the first people I met graduating from NYU were actors, Rizwan Manji and Purva Bedi, and they sort of were like, "Oh, you're a writer. I'm an actor. Let's like, you know, figure out what we can do." And like that, sort of like the comedy, like that sort of collaborative energy, like, and that fun that I had in my like 20s of just like trying stuff out with them, like definitely shaped like artistically who I would be, and like even producing Desipina shaped like sort of my aesthetic as well, like in terms of the writers that I met and the designers that I met, and like sort of how they approach their own art definitely are things that I was like, oh, okay, that's how they're approaching their art. This is like kind of try to fit yourself within like how every person is different, you know? It's like, where do I fit in as an artist? Like, where do I want to be within this fabric?
Right. Yeah, like what is your voice compared to like everyone else's?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like you have experienced any expectations or pressures as a South Asian artist, as a female playwright, in a time where conversations around representation are starting to happen slowly?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, actually, funny enough, like the fact that there are conversations happening kind of takes the pressure off of me in some ways, because I feel like, oh, this is good. There are lots of people out there, Bangin' It, Bhangra Nation is not for somebody. Like, I'm sure there's somebody out there creating something that is for that person. And
Right.
so that actually, for me, there was used to be a lot of pressure. It's like, oh, there's only going to get one thing produced. And if it's not the thing that everybody wants, then it's going to be terrible. But now I feel like there's multiple stories and avenues out there, and there's still not enough. But I feel like there are ways to find what you're looking for.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how you're looking for collaborators and the funding aspect of what gets produced and how you navigate that?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, I am drawn to, I'm just drawn to people who have a spark, have an energy, have a similar passion for the arts that I do, and the way I find people tends to be just kind of fortuitous. So with Sam, we were paired up on the 24-hour musicals, and when we didn't kill each other overnight, I was like, we should do something full-length. And with Ari, I was admiring of her work online, and then he workshopped Bangin' It, and then I was like, oh my god, we should do more and more and more. And so that's kind of how that happened. So that's kind of how my collaborators come in, and or through the funding of it all, where if a theater is like, I want to produce your play, they'll bring in actors and they'll recommend directors, and then I kind of get married in that way.
Yeah, and do you feel like there's also this, not to go back to that, but the scarcity mindset around funding? Because I feel like I did a research piece a few years ago on the drastic difference in funding that artists of color and women get in film and TV. So can you talk about how that applies in theater as well?
Yeah, it's pretty bad. I think this was years ago, but I think I read something where theaters of color, or theaters that specifically are for communities, get maybe 30% of the funding, or they don't get from the general pool. They don't get funded from the general pool. They get a fraction. They get funded from a fraction of it. So basically leaving all theaters of color to fight it out amongst that fraction of a pool.
Right.
I don't know if it's changed since then, but generally theaters, I think, are having a hard time figuring out where their funding is coming from. I think that when funding is at risk, theaters are less likely to take risks generally.
Sure.
I think they're just over it. They're like, no more risk. So then the season tends to be people that they have done before, or that they know, or that they feel their audience will like, and I don't know. It tends to be a little depressing when you look at the behind the scenes funding of it all.
Yeah. It's it's as if telling our stories are associated with risk. And that's something that so bothers me. And I was watching this Simone Ashley interview where she was like, I think it's time that, production companies stop looking at casting or telling the stories of artists of color as a risk, because we are the global majority. So you want to be seen, and there are actively audiences for these stories. So I don't know. I'm just ranting that it frustrates me about how, when funding has to be fought over, like you're saying.
Yeah, it's pretty frustrating, and even there's just so many ways in which people can say no, and I think that's can get wearisome.
Right. Yeah. And I think this will be an ongoing conversation with how arts in general is getting underfunded and will continue to be censored and silenced in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An uphill battle for sure.
Definitely. But So in an ideal situation, if you had like a magic wand or like all the agency in the world, what are some of the changes that you would like to see in the theater industry and entertainment industry in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the scarcity mindset, trying to get rid of that. I mean, I think it's like they're, I don't know, if I had a magic wand,
Mhm.
I was like, if I ran a theater, what would I do? I mean, I would actually give development. I would give opportunities to writers. Like I would try to tailor. I think so often artists are kind of treated sort of like babies in some way. Like there's a paternalistic aspect to the arts
Right.
sometimes where they're the gatekeepers and they're like the big daddies and like and like everybody else like listen to your daddy and like do what like daddy says because that's what's good for you. And I
Yeah.
think like really artists can be in the driver's seat, and like artists are so creative, they can get out of a lot of these circumstances. So like really being a little bit more artist responsive. I think another thing as I head into like mid career. I mean, my emerging career woes was always like, how do I get my big break? How do I get my big break? And like,
Right.
there is like no one big break, but I think that like through Desipina, like we were able to give people. Well, we took risks on people, and I think
Right.
like, definitely more people need to just take a risk and be like, let's try it out. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You give them the chance to grow and like whatever that is, and oftentimes people would cast folks that from our shows who didn't have credit before, but because now suddenly they had a credit, they would
Right.
them. So I think like bringing together generations that way, like people who are first time versus those who have been in it for a while, it's kind of a dream of mine.
Yeah.
More crossover between the mediums, so like TV, film, and theater being more because theater is such an incubator for that.
Right.
More that, and then now that I'm mid-career, as I was saying, I think like artists with families, it's there's not a lot out of resources out there for them or support structures, and so
Yeah.
that's something that I've been really kind of struggling with.
Yeah. Yeah, of like also just in general, how do artists survive?
Yeah, I think
It's hard.
generally, yeah. I
It's
think
hard.
health insurance for artists, if I had a magic wand and I could give everyone health insurance where they didn't have to worry about the number of weeks or whatever nonsense, I would do that.
Right. Oh my God. Yeah. It's so much. I feel like this is a good segue into asking if you have any advice for emerging and upcoming or aspiring artists, especially
Yeah,
those who are South Asian.
for sure. I think it's really easy to just sit at your computer and not like get out of your room as someone speaking from experience. And I think it's really important to identify like what you're passionate about and then find people who are similarly passionate about those things and really just kind of, I think no one does it alone. Like
Yeah.
you're always doing like there's the only way to keep going through this artistic field is to have collaborators, to have champions, to have peers, and your peers will be your champions and your peers will be your collaborators and vice versa. And it's just really important to find them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much power in like building community and having people say your name in rooms that you're not in.
Yeah,
In a good way, hopefully.
hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one question I like to ask every guest, because this show is called QISSAA, and QISSAA means episode. Can you share an influential episode or QISSAA from your life that shaped you as either a person or an artist?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I had a really good one before we started, and now it immediately like dropped out of my mind. But an influential episode from my life. I think you know there are like you know what, you always take the note. I think for me something really influential is that like you always take the no's to heart, like, oh my God, a no means like, I'm a terrible human and nobody ever wants to see me ever again, kind of thing. And I had an experience where they were like, no, I don't think this will work. But then like a year later, they called me up and were like, you know what, like we couldn't make that work, but we would like for you to come and do like a residency or like, and
Okay.
yeah. So for me, like that is really influential. It was a good reminder in a lot of ways. It was like, it's sometimes like it's easy to like want to give up when you hear a no and like want to just like forget it. But like, I think it's really important to just keep faith and to also have sort of like, I think it's like if you're gracious about it too, like and find a way to stay on people's minds, like then you will keep going. Sorry, better. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense to not just be like deterred by one no, because you never know when that opportunity will come up again because you're in the room. You're in the room. Yeah. It's like in acting, we talk a lot about like, it's about booking the room, not booking the job. So yeah, I definitely understand where you're coming from with that.
Yeah, so my inspirational story was I booked the room, not the
job. Can you tell us where we can find your work and if you have any upcoming projects you can share?
Yeah, I mentioned that Jackalope Theater at Neighborhood Watch is going to be up in May. You can generally find out sometimes my stuff on my website. I'm not as great about updating it, but usually I do. Or sometimes Instagram. I'll be, so Chicago is my next big step. I'm hoping for some summer stuff and we'll see.
Yeah, that's amazing. And where can people find your plays to read, to consume?
I have like short excerpts on my website, but also if folks are affiliated with schools, some of my stuff is published with the Alexander Street Press, which I know a lot of university libraries have in their like a digital database kind of thing. Or you can always email me, and I'm pretty kind about sending it out.
That's lovely. Thank you for not gatekeeping your work. I want to read more of your plays, so I'm excited to do so. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out and sharing your journey and I guess both your artistic vision and your vision for the industry.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and coughing fits and all.
No, you're so good. I hope you feel better.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Take care.
Then thank you for everyone who tuned in, and stay tuned for an announcement of the next QISSAA. All right, we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.